Welcome to another Lumion live stream tutorial, guys. This is Chris Walton from CweltonDesign, and in this tutorial I want to cover the basics on reflections in Lumion, helping you guys understand the three methods that we have inside of Lumion, how we can best take advantage of them, when to use them, when not to, and just helping you understand how Lumion kind of works and these reflections work. So reflections are obviously very important in architecture, especially when dealing with glass or metallic surfaces. And, really, realistically, as I've mentioned in other videos, everything reflects to a certain degree. We don't have to spend the time to mimic the concrete or something flat, having a tiny bit of reflectance, but everything does reflect to a certain degree. And so the things that are extra reflective, we want to make sure to get those things right and reflect them the best way that Lumion can do it with the time frame that we have. So in Lumion, there are three types of reflections. So I'll throw out some terms out here. So first, reflections that are always on, that we'll showcase in a second, is something called spherical or projected reflections, where this is what's always on. And I'm sure you've seen it when you turn something reflective and all of a sudden you start to see the clouds, regardless if you're inside or anywhere. That's projected reflections. It takes almost no performance. That's what's always on by default. Then I'll talk about planar reflections, which are perfect reflections at a huge cost of rendering the scene essentially twice. And the SpeedRay reflections, which are Lumion's most recent reflection effect that's come on, that really does, it's kind of the best of, it's kind of somewhere right in the middle, probably closer to the perfect reflections on planar. A great little cheat, being able to get some good reflections on curvilinear surfaces. So those are the three of them. So I'm going to go ahead and start explaining projected reflections. So here I am in Villa Cabrera. So we have glass here and reflectivity is turned all the way down. And so when we start to turn this up, instantly what we're going to see is these kind of blurry mountains in the distance. And that's those mountains. And we're seeing that all in there. That's what kind of comes on by default. And if we go inside, we'll even see mountains inside. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's how these reflections work. And let me show you how to control these reflections and where these come from. These are just kind of like a real default method of kind of estimating what the surfaces and areas that would reflect are. And the reason this is added is because if you had nothing, it would just not look realistic. But we can control exactly what that's showing and kind of get it a little bit more, to our advantage. So here we are in the Objects tab, and we're going to go down to Lights and Utilities. Click into here. So here's where we have all our lights. We're going to jump all the way over to the last tab called Utilities. So it's got all the great tools in here, but right now we're going to talk about reflection control. And just take a look at that object there. You guys might have seen tutorials, you might have seen this object before, but you can see that it's like one of those 360 fisheye panorama images mapped onto the sphere, because you can see like whatever surrounding some grass there and lights. So what this essentially is a camera. So instantly things changed depending where we put it. So this little sphere, it doesn't really matter exactly how big it is or not, but this sphere is essentially like a real-time 360-degree camera that's low resolution. That's just always kind of shooting out what it's seeing whenever you turn something to reflective, regardless of where it is in Lumion. If you only have projected reflections on, that's just kind of what it's programmed by default to show. So we're seeing the grill right there, because the grill is over here near our reflection sphere. And to clarify, the reflection sphere, like I mentioned, is always on. It's usually maybe somewhere up in the air. I don't know exactly where Lumion puts it by default, but just to be safe, to get maybe 80% correct or so, whatever it takes, it's set up in the air. So that's why you're seeing the mountains. And as you see, as we move this around, we can actually see more specifically what this is looking at. And I would recommend, if you have an interior scene, it doesn't hurt if you're trying to get all the reflections correct it never hurts to have this set up in here. That's how I used to do it. And so that kind of gives you an idea of where these reflections are coming from. You know, if I deleted this, well, it stayed there. So it's just not editable anymore. Sometimes it would reset back to the sky in previous versions, I think. But good news, you know, what I used to want to do, be able to control that sphere when I first saw that, like, I don't know, back in Lumion 3 or 4, you know, I tried to move it and animate it so I'd get more accurate reflections. But it never was really worth it too much, trying to get it to accurately move with the camera. As you can tell, things get thrown off, and this is, you know, full reflection. Oops, that's the opposite side of controlling that. You know, maybe you'd have more of a slight reflection, subtle reflection there. But, you know, I tried animating it and everything and setting it in each one of my scenes. It's kind of tedious, but the good news is what I noticed in the when you go into photo or video mode, we're looking at our reflections. First off, let's turn off any other reflections that have been added on here. Here we go, blank scene. So look at the trees there, you move, look at it update. So when you stop, I'm pretty sure Lumion is sticking the reflection sphere right on the camera. This is great. I mean, I think in animations it does it for every frame too. But as you guys can clearly see, this isn't exactly the best kind of reflections to really showcase. This helps. Let's turn on those trees all the way. But this is the lowest quality of reflections that we want to really be showcasing. It works good. It's good because there's hundreds of things in your scene that are reflecting, and you don't have time to take care of all of them. You know, if it's a smaller thing or a less subtle reflection, or it's even kind of blurry-ish, this is perfect. It's just fine. But now we're going to jump into the next type of reflections, which are actually the best reflections we can get in Lumion with limitations and cost. So that is planar reflections. So now we need to actually jump into the reflection effect in Lumion. And so you guys I'm sure you guys have seen this before. And so we have this edit tab here, we have a couple sliders here, and we have some low, medium, normal, and high quality toggles is here, and then there's SpeedRay, which we'll talk about last. So first off, let's set a reflection plane. So if you guys haven't done this before, maybe you guys are new and you've tapped on this edit button and you're really confused with what's going on here. It's like why am I adding a plane? Well, reflections in general, like actual reflections, if you were to use a really high-end renderer like V-Ray or so, or what the movies are rendering with, to render an actual reflection, you know, you have to bounce actual light rays and calculate where it's going to go after that, and it's very costly. And obviously in Lumion, you know, especially with that reflection sphere, you know, setup, everything needs to be running at a certain frame per second to be real time. So that's the sacrifice we have to make. And one old method, when you set a plane right here, let's do on the ground here. This is actually a metal ground I've set up in here. To get really good reflections, you actually have to render another camera, essentially shooting in that direction to actually see things that your camera isn't seeing. Like this could be my Lumion camera. I can't see the ceiling right now. But when you set up this reflection, you will. Let's adjust this a little more reflective. Doing the glossiness up. So you're seeing the tops of these mullions in the ceiling there, even though my camera is not looking at it. The way they're able to do this is by essentially rendering out a camera from where our camera is set up, and then another camera that's, you know, on this face looking up. And that's what's being shown in these reflections here. So it's a perfect mirror. So this is how you would create a perfect mirror. So if we were to take this glass here, I set a reflection plane on here. Let's turn up the reflectivity. And again, you're seeing a perfect mirror essentially. So quick question some people have had, how to create a perfect mirror. This is how you do it. Set up a planar reflection, crank that reflectivity slider all the way up, and you'll see it. And if you see really blurry reflections, you haven't done it right. Because that's the projected reflections, the spherical ones. So obviously it looks on glass, this is crucial. Getting nice, accurate reflections. Or if we have this flooring, it looks really good. With this metal, let's turn it down a little bit, just get a little bit of that blurriness right there. So we got these really nice reflections in there. So these are the best kind of reflections. They work extremely well, but they are limited in the fact that, as their name suggests, planar reflections, they can only work on perfectly flat planes. Now, this and projected reflections used to be the only method of reflections, and there were times when I would try to force it onto a curve. There was times when I'd have curved glass, and I would literally try to add to each plane, and you're limited to 10 planes. You can add up to 10. I highly recommend you don't add much more than 2 or 3 unless you have to. But we would try to add extra planes onto a curved surface, which is multiple planes, tons of planes. It doesn't work. It doesn't work well. This only really works for flat surfaces, which was a limitation when you were trying to show, really photorealistic, metallic round shapes, because you're stuck with these kind of reflections here. That's what SpeedRay's for. We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I'm going to explain the problem with, here, let's add it to this pool too. So these planes can be added to, as it says, water plane, standard, or glass. It cannot be added to something that has not been, assigned a material yet in Lumion. So if you just import it from SketchUp or Revit and have it touch the material, you can't add a plane to it until you actually go in and assign a plane. If it's green here, so I'll just go ahead and go standard. Give it a moment. Okay, now it has a materiality. Whether it needs to be reflective or not doesn't matter. It doesn't read this. It just reads that now there's a assigned Lumion material. And so when we go back in, now I can add a plane. And to remove a plane, or to find out which plane is which, just kind of hover over. They highlight each one, say we don't want this one on here anymore. Click on it to remove it. So I was going to talk about the drawbacks of this. And that's mainly, besides the only being on flat surfaces, it's performance oriented. Those are the issues. Look at that nice reflections in the water. That was an effect, I think in 5 they released to be able to do this on water. It just made a huge difference. But anyways, in my testing, adding one plane in Lumion could cost as much as 0.6 times. Like 60% longer render times per plane. So if you add, double that when you add 2 planes and so on up to 10 planes. That's why 10 planes is pretty insane. Unless you're on a super light project. If you're on anything that's medium or heavy, you're just it's gonna cripple everything, and your render times are gonna skyrocket. That's the big drawback to this. It comes at a cost. It's a very brute force way of dealing with this. So, and also I was going to talk about these sliders here. Normal kind of tones it down, I guess. Maybe it deals with SpeedRay. But if you turn it on low, it defaults it to the reflection sphere. So if you want to know a difference between the quality of reflection spheres, projected reflections, spherical reflections, that's the difference. Huge difference there. So sometimes you'll have glass, this is obviously really important for big. I would only save this for big reflective surfaces like the ground or water, or especially these big planes of glass. Now, one thing I've come across is sometimes we model and things aren't perfect. So when you go to add a plane here, like you would add one on this plane, but say it didn't match up with this one, And if it's not exactly the same plane, say these windows were pushed in like an inch or a half an inch, it won't match up. I did find a little shortcut. Oops. I did find a little trick to that. This reflection threshold, if you kind of push that up, it'll actually catch planes behind it. And I may have to explain that more in detail in another video, but it's a nice little trick. Just remember that if you have ones that are really close but aren't quite catching, go ahead and bump this up and you'll see. In the flicker reduction, I really don't get it any flickering anymore. Where's my last reflection plane? Let's go ahead and add it here again. You can kind of see these effects in real time. Flicker, you can see what it's doing. It's kind of just moving it back and forth. I usually don't have to touch it. I really haven't seen flickering in a long time. Maybe it's something they fixed, but that's there. And you can't see this effect, but it would basically start grabbing things behind it. Just remember that if you ever have that instance. So now let's go ahead and jump into SpeedRay. So let's eliminate all of these planes. Pretend we're just in projected reflections. So we turn on SpeedRay, we're instantly going to get treated to some decent reflections. So we're getting a weird effect here because these are, for whatever reason, these are actually two separate glass materials. Glass and then glass inside. I'm just going to turn glass inside invisible. Okay. Alright, so now we go back. I guess that wasn't the issue. Sometimes I have this problem. Oh, so, no, I understand why this is. Sorry, guys. Alright, so SpeedRay reflections is based on a technology or a method that a lot of other game engines use called screen space reflections. That really helps explain kind of how it works. It's basically rendering only what's inside of this our camera view here. Nothing more, nothing less. Look at that. Look at the stairs and that reflection. Notice how I'm starting to see more and more of it. You know, I'm not seeing the bottom step. Not seeing the bottom step there. Now I see the bottom step. You can just about see the bottom step there. Maybe for more reflective. So notice how I can see the pool. Pool's in reflection. Once it gets out of screen, you can't see the pool anymore. That's the limitation. That's the drawback of SpeedRay. It's tricking you into only rendering what's on the frame, what's on your camera, and not having to render anything more, so it barely costs anything performance-wise, as opposed to reflection planes being the most expensive things you can add, by far the most expensive thing you can add to your effects. If you have a, say, 6-hour render time with no reflection planes, you start adding 4 of those, it's going to, you know, we're talking 24 hour for times, potentially. In my testing, I recommend playing with it. Maybe if you have 2 or 3 render planes, render it out, see what it's quoting you, and then maybe try adding more or less and kind of seeing what it quotes you. It's always a good idea. So SpeedRay still works quite well. Maybe if you want to edit and look at these effects with these with the reflections on, go to Build with Effects. That keeps these things on. But we're seeing reflections right here from the tree. We're seeing reflections on the ground here at little to no cost. You really don't get very precise reflections like that at all from projected reflections. It works really well on. Let's see, can I edit this? That's an object. There, you can see it on the ground there. We're actually seeing reflections from the table, more local reflections, not just a big sphere that kind of generalizes everything. So it actually looks pretty decent. And when you do a rendered shot, it actually cleans up. It's kind of blurry. That's just preview. It cleans up pretty decently. It can be noisy at times, but it really does clean up better than what we're seeing right here. So there's kind of this combination of the reflection sphere and in SpeedRay. So There's some other examples I probably could have shown. There you go. You're seeing that in there too. So you kind of get the idea. There it is, on and off. Again, this also. So I think this normal one works more with SpeedRay than it does with planar reflections. I can see a noticeable difference in quality there. And then low turns it off. These effects don't affect SpeedRay at all. So, best case scenario, you just basically turn this on, and then you use your planar reflections. Like I said, I kind of tested this, and it was so insignificant of a render time difference. It's not anything to worry about. So you should pretty much just always have it on. I don't see a reason even not to have it on. But the big problem is it's a pro feature. So I should have mentioned that projected reflections and planar reflections are in all versions of Lumion, and SpeedRay reflections is only a pro feature. So pretty much that should essentially always be on. And then for more precise reflections, we can add our reflection planes here. Say we don't quite like what's still showing up on the glass. Oops. Here, yeah, I had to add it from the other side. Just because I made that inside glass invisible. All right. So this is kind of best case scenario. Yeah. We're seeing really accurate reflections on the ground and here. But at the same time, when we get close up, we're seeing reflections on the curved surfaces, which I forgot to mention again. SpeedRay works on curves. It works pretty well on curved surfaces. This is not the best example to show it on. But you just have to take my word for it. Play around with it on some like silverware or other reflective surfaces that are close to each other. Let's see if we have anything upstairs. You've seen that effect there, that clipping. So just be aware. As long as you guys are aware of its limitations, there's always ways to work around it. I mean, Lumion's full of limitations. All our softwares are full of limitations. Learning how to utilize them utilize them and understand them. That's the biggest thing. So maybe I'll just do a rendered shot right here. You can kind of see it clear up. So see, it cleared up pretty well. There's not nearly as much noise. It looks quite frankly pretty good. Maybe I should bring in some objects and you'd really be able to tell. And it came up on the walls here. I did not add a reflection plane there. That's from SpeedRay. It cleans up pretty well. So those are the 3 reflections methods. Hopefully I answered quite a bit of questions, cleared up some understanding. And I want to read one other last comment when it comes to working with materials in reflections. If you're editing your materials, you need to edit your materials with build with effects on. Because look at this, look at the difference here between the floor here with it on and off. So if I were working with effects right now, turn it off, and I want to get this just right. I'm like, oh, that doesn't quite look right. That's not what I'm looking for. It's not as reflective as I want. I don't know. Maybe I'll just set it right here. And then you go into here, and it looks entirely different. So what you'd want to do, whether it's SpeedRay or reflection plane, in SpeedRay and reflection planes look different as well. Whether if I had SpeedRay on or not, they render it in different ways. And so I'm just saying, I recommend editing your materials with build with effects to really get the more accurate way it's going to actually be rendered. And so that's about it for reflection, guys. Again, so you have spherical reflections or projected. There's lots of names for it. Planar reflections on the planes, and SpeedRay, which reflect what's on the screen without adding much performance at all. all really great. It's good having all of these options, and reflections are starting to look pretty decent in Lumion since they added SpeedRay. On some of these curved surfaces, just be very wary of the planar reflections and not overusing them. And some people, if you're begging for more reflection planes than 10, you're doing something wrong. So utilize SpeedRay to your advantage. Alright guys, thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. Please subscribe, and until next time.